Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 17, which is Life on Earth. So what do we know about the history of life on Earth, and how do we know it? What factors help to explain the distribution of species on Earth, and what are the major groups of organisms, and how are organisms placed in groups? So how old is the Earth? They have estimated the age of the Earth to be roughly around 4.5 billion years old. The way they've known that is because they've collected rocks during the Apollo missions from the moon, and they've brought those back and analyzed those rocks. The way they analyzed those rocks was using what's called radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is they measure the amount of radioactivity present in a rock, which is used as a geologic clock. Radioactive dating uses what's called radioactive isotopes, which are an unstable form of an element that decays into another element by emitting energetic particles called radiation. Here's a picture of that, where minerals and rocks contain a certain amount of radioactive isotopes which decay and transform into different altogether elements. As you can see here, this uranium decays a couple times to thorium and then to lead. The end result is usually a more stable isotope. Here's another example of how you would analyze the rock. You have a newly formed rock, which is 100% uranium. Over some time, it decays into uranium and some lead, and then over time it decays into more lead, and that some of that uranium is left over. They can actually measure the exact time by measuring what's called a half-life. And a half-life is the time it takes for half of the isotope in a sample to break down. And this is used to determine the age of materials in which they are found. Here's a picture of the decay of uranium. It takes about 1.3 years of zircon to decay into 85% uranium. 2.4 billion years old of zircon has decayed to about 65% uranium, so on and so forth. And it's a constant decay rate. So anywhere on this line will tell you not only how old it is in billions of years old, but also you measure that with the percent of uranium found in that rock. So when and how did life begin? They believe life began about 3 billion years ago. However, there's no evidence that points in that direction, but we can use what we know about the fossil record and hypothesize. Harold Urey and Stanley Miller hypothesized that they could synthesize organic molecules by replicating the chemical environment of the early Earth. Here's their lab setup, where they actually have what they believed was the early Earth's atmosphere, and it's filled with poisonous gases. Here are two electrodes that are hooked up to a power source. They believe that the climate was very unstable, where there was a lot of lightning, and that lightning was used as activation energy to react these molecules. So what their experiment yielded was new organic molecules, including amino acids, which we know are the building blocks of proteins. And they also showed that it was possible to create molecules of life, like amino acids, from inorganic materials. So what was life like a million years ago? Well, we have to look at the fossil record. And the fossil record, we know that is basically a geologic timescale of Earth and what it looked like from the past to what it looks like to the present. Here's a picture of a geologic timeline. Shows that the Earth's geography and climate have gone through dramatic changes. So here are the different time scales: the Precambrian age, the Paleozoic age, the Mesozoic age, and our current, which is the Cenozoic age. We have found that the oldest known fossils date back to about 3.5 billion years ago. We know that these fossils, um, the atmosphere uh, probably did not contain any oxygen, but it contained um, other gases that were probably really, really toxic. And in these unicellular prokaryotes, which they found in these early fossils, use these really toxic gases as fuel sources. They've figured out, or they've hypothesized, that unicellular photosynthetic organisms, so unicellular means one cell, probably emerged between 3 to 2.5 billion years ago. And photosynthetic implies that oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. This is important because this created what's our atmosphere today, ozone layer. Ozone is oxygen O3, which protects us from UV radiation. Now, this is important because this probably allowed uh, organisms to evolve onto land because it's not being bombarded by UV radiation as much as oxygen started to accumulate. The first multicellular eukaryotic organism probably was green algae. They believe was about started to evolve about 1.2 billion years ago, and then once that oxygen started to accumulate into the water, marine invertebrates evolved about 600 million years ago. So they think that the cradle for life was in the water. That's why when they go looking for life on other planets or even moons of other planets, they're looking for water because they believe that's the cradle of life. After um, the marine invertebrates arrived, then the diversification of the animal world happened during what's called the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion led to land being colonized by lots of different species of plants, and then after the plants came, then the animals came. After about 250 million years ago, there was a mass extinction. And remember, an extinction is an elimination of all individuals in a species. The first known mass extinction was called the Permian extinction. After extinctions, there's usually survivors, and those survivors start to spread and diversify because of natural selection. And they're able to colonize newly open habitats, and this allowed for what's called adaptive radiation. So in red, this is a mass extinction. Here's another mass extinction. And as you can see here, after a mass extinction, a species starts to emerge, like the fish. So this would be the age of the fish. And then after that mass extinction, then you have amphibians. This is the era of amphibians. There's another one. There's a mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, about 65 million years ago. Um, this extinction um, of between 50% and 90% of all species, and this is when the dinosaurs died out. This is the one we hear about all the time. So there's a pattern of extinction followed by adaptive radiation, and this pattern of adaptive radiation is called punctuated equilibrium, where you have periods of bursts of species that change as a result of sudden environmental changes. So now that all these species are extinct, this allowed for open habitats for other species to evolve and to live in those different habitats. So why are there no penguins at the North Pole and no polar bears at the South Pole? Well, it probably had to do with the distribution of organisms. that reflects their evolutionary history. So we could probably say that penguins evolved in the South Pole and polar bears evolved in the North Pole. This all has to do with an idea called biogeography, which is the study of how organisms are distributed in geographical space. Now, geographical space we know is fluid because of plate tectonics, and plate tectonics is the movement of the Earth's upper mantle and crust, and this influences geographical distribution of land masses and therefore the organisms of which it resides. We know that the land masses were once connected, called Pangaea, and over time, these plates move these land masses to what it looks like today. We probably can hypothesize that though the penguins primarily lived in Antarctica, the earliest penguin fossils were found near New Zealand. So what can we say? So New Zealand's here, that New Zealand and all these red area where you see penguin fossils were probably once connected to Antarctica. So are creatures that look alike closely related? Well, common ancestry is not the only reason that two species might appear similar. It's not always the case, however. So there's this idea called convergent evolution. And convergent evolution has to do with organisms that are not closely related evolve similar adaptations as a result of independent episodes of natural selection. So, for example, the cold water fish um, and perhaps maybe a dolphin. A dolphin is a mammal. Fish are obviously fish. And they have similar features that allow them to live in similar environments, such as water. Um, Dolphins have fins, fish have fins, however, they're not made of the same material, and therefore that's what's called convergent evolution. They have similar structures, but they didn't evolve from a common ancestor. So how many species are there on Earth, and how do scientists keep track of them? There's an estimate of between 5 and 30 million total species on Earth. 1.5 have been formally described. So that means that there's a lot that we still don't know about or have discovered. So how are these species kept track of by scientists? There's a science called taxonomy, which is a systematic approach of identifying, naming, and classifying organisms on the basis of shared traits. And we have different levels of classification. The biggest level is called the kingdom. The next level is phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So if we're going to classify humans, we classify them in the kingdom of Animalia, phylum Chordata. Chordata represents that they have that they're vertebrates. Class is Mammalia, mammal. Order primates. Family Hominidae. Genus Homo, and species Homo sapiens. So how are species on how are these categories used? These categories are increasingly exclusive until finally one member is included. Example of categories, you have vertebrates, animals with rigid backbones, and then you have a grouping of mammals, which are also vertebrates, and what makes them mammals are mammary glands and body that is covered with hair. Phylogeny looks at the evolutionary history of groups of organisms and represented by a diagram called phylogenetic tree, also called a cladogram. So in this, you can see here as time goes on, this, where there's an intersection, that represents a common ancestor. common ancestor, and we can see that these two, based on what they're looking at, are the most closely related. So how many branches does a tree of life have? And since each living species sits on its own branch in the phylogenetic tree, the complete tree of life has many branches as there are species in the world. And again, we know it's incomplete because we still have yet to discover a lot of different species um, that we hypothesize exist. The highest level of modern classification is called domain, and there's three main domains. You have bacteria, which are all the bacteria that we talk about on the news, like E. coli and streptococcus and all those staphylococcus. Then you have archaea, which are another type of bacteria, and these archaea live in very extreme environments. So halophiles are the ones that love salt. You have thermophiles, which love heat. So these are bacteria that they think are live in the most primitive of Earth's conditions, but have evolved to live today. And then you have eukarya, which are everything else, everything that's eukaryotic. So these two are prokaryotic. This is eukaryotic, and they all evolved from what we know as a common ancestor. So to summarize, the age of Earth is determined by measuring the amount of radioactive isotopes present in the rock, called radiometric dating. Life on Earth emerged in stages as inorganic molecules, then they combine to form organic ones. Earth's history can be divided into important eras and periods. History of life on Earth is marked by repeated extinctions and then adaptive radiations marked by punctuated equilibrium. Ancient movement of Earth's major landmasses affected the eventual distribution of species. Convergent evolution is the evolution of similar adaptations in response to similar environmental challenges. And biologists sort organisms into a series of nested categories based on shared anatomic and genetic features.